And those of you who are enthusiasts for race courses will know that the home straight is taken at a gallop. So, who were the Holy Fathers of Nicaea? First of all, we need to consider how many there were. The Council of Nicaea was called by the Emperor Constantine soon after he had defeated Licinius to become sole emperor of the Roman Empire. He invited every bishop in the empire to the council and made the public conveyances and horses and mules available to the participants. The bishops with their entourages started to arrive in Nicaea on the 20th of May. There seem to have been preliminary discussions from this point, leading to the arrival of the emperor himself on the 14th of June, when the formal sessions began. The creed was drawn up on the 19th of June. The council had finished its work by the 25th of August, when it closed. Eusebius of Caesarea says that more than 250 bishops were present, but adds that there were an almost innumerable number of priests, deacons, and acolytes as well. St. Athanasius, who was an eyewitness and a member of the council, speaks of 300 bishops, and in his letter Ad Aphros, he talks about 318. This number has been universally adopted, and it was St. Athanasius himself who first drew a parallel with the account in Genesis 14:14, when we are told of the number of Abraham's servants, or perhaps his clansmen. This passage is read as one of the three readings at Vespers when we commemorate the council. Modern historians have asserted that this passage has been used to give the number and that there were actually far fewer fathers, perhaps 200 or so. I have appended a list to this, which I'm not going to read out, which is 237, but we certainly don't have them all. It does not seem to have occurred to them that St. Athanasius was struck by the coincidence, which is why he mentioned it. When St. Epiphanius of Salamis was writing in his Panarion about 400 AD, the signatures of all 318 fathers still existed. However, it is worth pointing out that the council went on for some time, and there may have been a considerable amount of coming and going. Furthermore, some bishops, such as the Bishop of Rome, St. Sylvester, were represented by two priests. Does that count as one or two? Some of the fathers were chorepiscopi, country bishops, and given that he is shown in almost all traditional icons of the council, we must surely include St. Athanasius, who at the time was a deacon. There is really no reason to dispute that there were about 318 fathers. And in this icon here, you will see down the bottom Arius with his hands over his ears. But oddly enough, in that icon, you don't have St. Athanasius. Each of the fathers was required to sign the creed, which should give us a list of all the bishops. However, the several lists we now have are incomplete and have suffered from copyists and time. One which gives the areas the bishops came from, that is, the provinces after the reorganization by Diocletian, was collected and published in the journal Byzantium in 1939 by E. Honigman. I have worked from the English translation, however this list is by no means exhaustive. For instance, he does not mention 8 pro-Arius bishops. 6 of these were prepared to sign the creed. 2 were not, Secundus of Ptolemais and Theonas of Marmarica. They were subsequently banished and cannot be counted as amongst the fathers. As I say, I am appending a list of the fathers whose names we still know to the end of this paper for completeness, which you may read when it is published. I will spare you the tedium of reading it out. However, there is an amusing comment in an early Coptic manuscript from possibly the end of the 4th or beginning of the 5th century, which says that when the fathers were asked to stand up when agreeing to an item, there were always 319. However, when they sat down, it was 380. This created some puzzlement, and it was eventually decided that the 319th Holy Father must be the Holy Spirit himself. The Holy Fathers. There were 4 bishops who were present or were represented at the council whose sees subsequently became patriarchates. First of all, there is St. Sylvester, the Bishop of Rome. He's shown in this icon with a tiara, which is quite wrong, but never mind. In fact, he was not present, but was represented by two priests, Victor and Vincent. It is recognized that they, with St. Athanasius, at the time a deacon, were in the forefront of the opposition to the teachings of Arius. Sylvester was not the Bishop of Rome at the time of Constantine's victory of the Milvian Bridge, and the account that he was responsible for baptizing Constantine after the battle, as recorded in the Liber Pontificalis, is spurious. The bishop at that time was Miltiades. He reigned from 310 to 314. He was accused by the North Africans of being a traditor, from which we get the word traitor. He had handed over the scriptures to the persecuting authorities. Two of his predecessors, Marcellinus and Marcellus, 295 to 303 for Marcellinus, 305 to 306 for Marcellus, may indeed have sacrificed to idols during the great persecution. However, Sylvester was Bishop of Rome for a considerable time, from January 314 to 335, and he was in post when Constantine erected several important churches in Rome: St. John Lateran, St. Peter's in the Vatican, Santa Croce in Jerusalem. The Archbishop of Alexandria, Alexander, was elected in 312, and we've had quite a lot about him today, and it was he who first attempted to resolve the problems of the Meletian schism. We have not actually discussed the Meletian schism. I don't think it will really vex us if we don't at this point. And also the problem of Arius. He called a local council in 321, but this failed to resolve the problem. It is suggested that Arius hoped to be elected to the See of Alexandria, and this was a motive for his advancement of his heretical ideas. Alexander firmly supported the Orthodox tradition and the First Council. He died on April the 17th, 326. His right-hand man at the council was St. Athanasius, who is remembered as one of the most important and greatest of the Church Fathers. He was elected to replace Alexander as bishop and reigned off and on from 328 to 373. Apart from his theological writings, he is remembered for 3 canons. Canon here means a rule of the church. It's still the idea of a straight line, but it's a church rule. The second of which lists the, inverted commas, canonical books of the Bible for the first time. Another is concerned with how Arians who repent are to be treated. This is not the place to go into the details here, but it should be noted that the baptism of Arians was accepted as authentic, reiterated in Canon 95 of the Quinisex Council. Athanasius also wrote the life of St. Anthony. He died on the 2nd of May, 373. The Archbishop of Antioch, St. Eustathius, was one of the most prominent opponents of Arius. Born about 270, he was elected Bishop of Berea, which is now Aleppo. Then in 323, he was translated to Antioch. After the council, he wrote extensively against the teachings of Arius. However, several Arian bishops, Eusebius of Nicaea, Theognis of Nicaea, Eusebius of Caesarea, gathered a synod at Antioch with the intention of removing Eustathius. This they achieved, and he was exiled to Trajanopolis, where he died sometimes later in 337. He was fully exonerated by the church, and he is commemorated on the 21st of February. In 484, his relics were returned to Antioch. It is believed that it was St. Eustathius who baptized St. John Chrysostom. The Bishop of Jerusalem was Macarius. He was present at the council, but is primarily noted as being the bishop when St. Helena visited Jerusalem, finding the true cross and building the church of the Holy Sepulchre. He is to be found on icons of the elevation of the cross, holding up the cross. He was Bishop of Jerusalem from 314 to 335. There was a bishop of Byzantium, Alexander, but at this point it was not, of course, called Constantinople. He was not present at the council, but was represented by one of his presbyters called Alexander. We know the names of a small number of bishops who had come from the west. These were Osius of Cordova, Cecilian of Carthage, Marcus of Calabria, Nicasius of Dijon, and Domnus of Stridon in Pannonia, an area that we think of as Hungary We do not know of any fathers that came from Britain. Of these Western bishops, the most significant is St. Osius of Cordova. He was born in Cordova in 256 and is believed to have suffered during the Great Persecution. The Synaxarion says that he bore the marks of persecution on his body, but we do not have further information as to what this might entail. About 295 he was elected Bishop of Cordova and somehow became a friend and confidant of the Emperor Constantine. He was sent by Constantine to Alexandria to try to resolve the Arian problem, but this was evidently unsuccessful. He was by this time quite an old man, 67. He seems to have advised Constantine to call the Council of Nicaea, and it is believed that he may have presided at some of the sessions when the emperor was absent. He continued to defend the Orthodox faith at the Council of Sardica. He was exiled for this, along with St. Athanasius and several other bishops. When he was nearly 100 years old, he was forced by the Emperor Constans I to sign the Faith of Sirmium. This Arian document avoided the use of the word homoousios, and he was taken back to Spain, where he repented of this weakness. He died on the 27th of August 357 as a very old man, more than 100. There were some bishops who came from outside the empire. We know of John of Persia, Theophilus, the metropolitan of the Goths, and St. James or Jacob of Nisibis. The latter was born about 275 and was a hermit. He was elected Bishop of Nisibis in northern Mesopotamia, which had a significant Christian population. In the campaigns that were going on at the time with the Persians, he was arrested by the Caesar, Maximinus Dia or Daza, and tortured. One of the complications with this particular piece of history is we have all these emperors who are Max something, Maximian, Maxentius, Maximinus, and it's very easy to confuse them. He attended the council when he was where he was opposed to Arius. On return, he was influential with the Persian king, Shapur II, who he persuaded not to persecute Christians. However, something should be said concerning the fathers who were sympathetic to Arius. The sources tell us that there were initially 17 bishops. The foremost of these was Eusebius of Nicomedia. The others are as follows: Theognis of Nicaea, Maris of Chalcedon, Theodoros of Heraclea, Menophantus of Ephesus, Patrophilos of Scythopolis, Narcissus of Cilicia, Paulinus of Tyre, Theodotus of Laodicea, Athanasius of Anazarbos, Aetius of Lydda, Secundus of Ptolemais, Theonas of Marmarica, Gregory of Berytus, and with some reservations, the historian Eusebius of Caesarea. This is actually 15 names, so 2 are missing. To start with, 5 of these refused to sign the creed: Eusebius of Nicomedia, Theognis of Nicaea, Maris of Chalcedon, Theonas of Marmarica, and Secundus of Ptolemais. However, adopting a fudge, the first 3 eventually signed by inserting an iota into homoousios, so it became homoiousios, meaning of similar rather than the same. Theonas and Secundus were excommunicated, anathematized, and banished along with their associates, than Arius. Later on, Eusebius of Nicomedia and Theognis of Nicaea were also banished, as they refused to accept the banishment of Arius. Eusebius of Nicomedia was reconciled later. Eusebius the historian was sympathetic to the Arian position, or at any rate inclined towards it, but avoided being classed as an Arian. It is worth noting the following points. First, 17 is a very small number compared with the whole council, about 5%. They are all Eastern bishops. Some of them are clustered in distinct areas: Libya, Secundus and Theonas, the area that Arius himself came from; Pontica, Eusebius of Nicomedia, Theognis of Nicaea, Maris of Chalcedon, and what is now the Levant: Petrophilus of Scythopolis, Narcissus of Cilicia, Paulinus of Tyre, Aetius of Lydda, Eusebius of Caesarea, Gregory of Berytus. It is not unreasonable to conclude that these bishops came under the direct influence of Arius in Libya and the Levant, and under Eusebius of Nicomedia in Pontica. A few of the fathers had remarkable stories attached to them. There may be a kernel of truth in them all, but I think we should assume that a certain amount of broidery has become attached to them over the years. So first of all, there was Paphnutius. The historian Rufinus gives some information about him. He was from Egypt, a bishop of the Upper Thebaid, which is Luxor, if you've been to Egypt. Rufinus tells us that he had his right eye gouged out and had his knees cut off during the persecution of the Emperor Maximian. He had worked several miracles, cast out evil spirits, healed the sick by his prayers, restored sight to the blind, and the power of their limbs to the lame. The emperor was very fond of him, and we are told made a considerable fuss of him, venerating the eyeless socket. He is of particular significance in that he persuaded the council to avoid imposing celibacy on the clergy. He defended St. Athanasius at the Synod of Tyre in 338. It is thought he died about 356. He should not be confused with a contemporary ascetic of the same name, who was a Meletian schismatic. The second was Spiridon of Tremithus, who was a shepherd in Cyprus, who became a bishop, continued to attend his flocks, and made himself famous by his miracles and prophecies. There are two stories that connect him to the Council of Nicaea. On his way to the council, the following happened to him. The bishop's fame had spread far beyond the small island of Cyprus, and those who sided with Arius were looking for a way to keep him from attending the council. Even though the bishop was relatively unlearned in the formal sense of the word, and many miracles worked through him were well known, the Arians feared that his deeds would influence the decisions of the more educated fathers. When Spiridon paused in his journey to rest for the night at an inn, the Arians came under cover of darkness and decapitated both of the mules which he and his deacon were riding. Before dawn, the deacon went to the stable to prepare the mounts and discovered what the heretics had done. He ran to tell the bishop. St. Spiridon put his hope in the Lord and told his deacon to go back and put the mules' heads back on their bodies. The deacon went quickly and did what he had been told, but in his haste and the darkness placed the head of the white mule on the body of the brown mule, and the head of the brown mule on the body of the white mule. At once the mules came to life and rose to their feet. The saint gave thanks to God. They mounted their mules, continued on their way to the council. When they arrived at Nicaea, all the people who saw this were amazed, for the brown mule had a white head, and the white mule had a brown head. Best of all, the wicked scheme of the heretics failed, and the saint arrived at the council, where he proved to be a great defender and teacher of the faith. And in this icon up here, you can see that they've had their head swapped round. Another story, incidentally, it's worth noting that in Orthodox understanding, there are a lot of stories which are intended to be funny, but they're intended to be funny in order to convey something of the truth. And there are lots of these, a whole genre of them. The other story recounted of St. Spiridon is that he was having great difficulty explaining to an Arian philosopher the truth of the Holy Trinity. So in frustration, he held up a clay tile and squeezed. Out of the top sprang fire, out of the bottom water, leaving earth crumbling in his hand. This did the trick. The philosopher was converted and later baptized. Spiridon's incorrupt relics still exist in Corfu, and miracles continue to happen through his intercession. There is another wonder worker connected with the council who must be mentioned, St. Nicholas of Myra. He became so utterly frustrated with Arius, who in many icons we see with his hands covering his ears, that he hit him on the jaw. This happened after the emperor arrived, and there were serious consequences. Nicholas was confined and deposed, but was miraculously restored to his place and status. Constantine the Great, I quote, Making an assessment of Constantine I the Great is essentially a leap of faith. Whichever way one jumps, many of the sources present pure, unadulterated glorification of him, while others are vitriolic in their hatred, and since Constantine is so crucial to the history of the Church, much modern commentary is determined overtly or otherwise by the author's attitude toward Christianity. Even neutrals can be biased. Nevertheless, as Constantine is certainly to be included among the fathers, I am left with no alternative but to make an assessment. He was born in Nasos, 273 or 4. His father was Constantius Chlorus, his mother Helena, a Christian. His father was declared Caesar, junior emperor of the West, by Diocletian in 293. Constantius Chlorus was under Maximian, the Augustus of the West. Maximian controlled Italy, an area well north of the Alps, the western part of North Africa and Spain. Constantius controlled Britain and Gaul, with two disputed frontiers along the Rhine and north of Hadrian's Wall. However, when appointed, he did not control Britain. Here there was an independent usurping emperor with 3 legions called Carausius. This character ruled from 286 until he was murdered in 293 by his finance minister Electus, who then was proclaimed emperor. He was deposed by Constantius and put to death, who had to reconquer Britain. This is significant, I contend, for it follows that Constantius had won some of his section of the empire for himself. During this period, his son, Constantine, was in Nicaea with Diocletian and then Galerius as a kind of political hostage in training. At this time, he was involved in 5 military campaigns, 3 with Diocletian and 2 with Galerius. In 3-4-5, the reason for 3-4-5 is that the year doesn't start in the same as it does now. He escaped and returned to Britain. Here he was involved in a further campaign with his father against the Picts. His father died on campaign, and Constantine was proclaimed Augustus by the troops in York on the 25th of July, 306. In total, Constantine was involved in 24 military campaigns, 18 against barbarians, 1 against the Persians, and 5 civil wars. At this point, we need to track back a few years to the reign of Gallienus. We've heard about Gallienus earlier this morning. It won't take me long to do that. He was the emperor from 253 to 268, which was quite a long time in the 3rd century. They were generally bumped off after about 2 years. Unlike his father, Valerian, who persecuted Christians, Gallienus stopped the persecution and gave Christians freedom of worship and the ability to hold property. This remained in place until the Great Persecution in 303. But this persecution was not universal throughout the empire, and it did not happen in the area controlled by Constantius Chlorus in Britain and Gaul or under Constantine. This is one reason why there are so few Roman martyrs in Britain. 3 that I can think of. From 306 to 310, Constantine campaigned on 3 occasions against barbarians to the east of the Rhine and once against Picts beyond the Hadrian's Wall. After a further 3 campaigns, Constantine led his troops south and defeated his rival emperor Maxentius at the famous Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Constantine was welcomed in Rome and Italy and now controlled the whole of the Western Empire. There was a further 6 campaigns, including 2 civil wars, before Constantine had defeated his other rival emperor Licinius to become sole emperor in 324. Now, the point to note here is that Constantine was fundamentally a general, an important consideration when considering his character. He will have learned a great deal about human nature and administration. And we should note that not only was he a general, he was an extremely successful general, and thus had the loyalty of his troops. The next point to note is that Constantine reformed the coinage. For the whole of the 3rd century, the Roman emperors, who were usually emperor for not much more than a couple of years before they were murdered, were chronically short of money. Constantine solved this problem by a wholesale plundering of all the pagan temples, taking their gold and silver, so much, in fact, that it kept the empire solvent for several hundred years. the emperors devised an ingenious system. The troops and civil servants were paid in gold coins, solidi. Has he got any at the back? No. At certain periods, each of them was paid individually by the emperor. The emperor was standing with bags of gold, and he dished them out to the people. These solidi were far too valuable for daily use, so they had to be exchanged for copper coins of various values, provided, needless to say, by the emperor. So the emperor got his gold back. It was forbidden to export gold, but some emperors would on occasion give gold to neighbouring states, but most of this returned as the barbarians exchanged them with goods from the empire. The looting of the temples cannot have endured Constantine to the pagans. So what of Constantine's religious beliefs? We've heard quite a lot about that this morning. Here's a little bit extra. We know that his mother was a Christian, and it is probable that he learned quite a lot about the faith from her. But we have no actual evidence for this. When he was with Diocletian and Galerius, he must have been aware of and probably witnessed martyrdoms of Christians after 303, and he himself must have sacrificed to idols. It was not long after the persecution started that he escaped and returned to his father in Britain. Then there is the account of his visions. A panegyric, a hymn of praise, was given at Trier, probably in August 310, which justified Constantine's claim to the throne. And I'm quoting, "The first is when the panegyric asserts that somewhere along the journey from Cologne to Arles to defeat Maximian, Constantine had the first of his attested visions, and one that is not usually described in later Christian sources. According to the panegyric, Constantine had a vision of Apollo at a temple of Apollo. In effect, Constantine was either affirming his affiliation with Apollo, or, according to recent analysis, his panegyrist was conceiving of Constantine as a latter-day Augustus, the first Roman emperor who had been linked with Apollo. In the eyes of the panegyrist, and doubtless of Constantine, Constantine was to be the new Augustus. Interestingly, at the same time, Constantine replaced the image of Mars with the image of Sol Invictus on the back of his coins, on the reverse of his coins, a deity conventionally identified with Apollo. At this early point in his career, and despite his alleged portrayal as a Christian, Constantine would shape his gods, whatever and whoever they might be, to suit his particular need. The second reason for proclaiming him as Augustus is that he claimed descent from the Emperor Claudius II. We don't know if that is true. However, something happened to Constantine before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. A dream, a vision in the sky, the sources are not clear, but something happened. Constantine appears to have had a significant spiritual experience which changed him. From this point on, he was concerned to stop the persecution of Christians elsewhere in the empire and to restore property to the church and Christians. There followed the so-called Edict of Milan. The two surviving emperors, Augusti, agreed to meet at Milan, Constantine for the west and Licinius for the east. Friendship was secured by Licinius marrying Constantine's sister in Milan. There was, in fact, no edict. Licinius issued a letter that was sent to his provincial governors, and by convention this was in the names of both emperors. It was issued either from Nicaea or from Caesarea after he had returned from Milan. It simply extended to the east protection to Christians, which was already enjoyed in the west. And it is quite wrong to think that at this point Christianity became the religion of the empire. It didn't. But Christians were free to worship, own property, and proselytize. From a religious point of view, it is worth noting some of the things that Constantine did. He started a building program of churches that involved Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, and Jerusalem. He built New Rome, Constantinople, and founded it as a Christian city with the building of 50 churches. Now, the reason he could destroy Byzantium was that in the war against Licinius, he had to besiege Byzantium, and he took it by storm. So therefore it was his. He owned it by right of conquest. Therefore, he could flatten it. He required that a copy of the Christian scriptures should be placed in each church. This is the first time we could start talking about the Bible. He made Sunday the day of rest throughout the empire, so that Christians of whatever status would be able to attend the liturgy. And of course, he summoned the Council of Nicaea in order to bring peace throughout the empire in every possible way. Now, there are those who argue that as he was only baptized when approaching death, the idea that this actually happened on his deathbed is not what the sources say, and use this to suggest that he was never really a Christian. They also point out that he put the Sol Invictus on his coins. This is true, and it was a common reverse design for several emperors of the 3rd century. Now then, there is the Sol Invictus on the back of his coin, okay? There should be one of Probus. That is a coin that's been greatly enlarged, but you see the Sol Invictus in his chariot going across. However, in the grottos under St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican can be seen a mosaic from the 3rd century portraying Christ as Sol Invictus. Can we have that one? There. So that is a very early icon of Christ, and he is there portrayed as Sol Invictus, an artistic euphemism understood by Christians. Well, we cannot have it both ways. If Christ could be portrayed as Sol Invictus, and this was understood by Christians, then this must be equally true of the coin reverses. And we need to bear in mind that probably at least 90% of the empire's inhabitants were in some sense pagans. Constantine had to be careful if he were to survive long enough to die in his own bed. Now, my point here is this. The 8th day, the day of the sun, was and still is, of enormous significance because it is the day of the new creation. It is the day of the resurrection, of course, but it is the new creation, the start of an entirely different world. And Constantine clearly knew this, and by putting Sol Invictus on his coins, he was demonstrating to Christians that this was important. He was demonstrating to pagans he didn't know what he was doing. All right. There is also the problem of Crispus, Constantine's eldest son, and his second wife, Fausta. They both died within a short space of time in 326, and it is suggested that Constantine had put them to death. It's rather more than suggested. I mean, most sources say that he was involved in it. The sources that make this accusation are late, and in fact we have no idea why they died. It may have been at the command of Constantine. It could also have been a mutual suicide pact if they had become lovers. Fausta was not Crispus's mother. What Constantine did do was issue a damnatio memoriae, closing down all discussion about their fate, which is why all the sources are late. We find evidence of this in the works of Eusebius, where before 326 we find him praising Crispus. After the damnatio, his name is erased from later editions and later works. There is, I believe, good evidence that Constantine had some kind of spiritual conversion experience before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. When Lucilius fell out with Constantine, he resumed the persecution of Christians. The 40 martyrs of Sebaste date from this period. Constantine had ambitions to become sole or senior emperor and bring stability and peace to the empire and the church. As there was no peace in the church at that time, he called the Council of Nicaea and took part in the discussions. It is important to note that many of these fathers had been persecuted themselves or seen members of their congregation martyred. The faith they had suffered for and seen others die for was of huge importance for them. The vast majority of the fathers were determined to preserve the integrity of the faith which they had received and that they had received from the apostles. I quote again. The questions the fathers considered was not what they supposed Holy Scripture might mean, nor what from a priori arguments thought would be consistent with the mind of God, but something entirely different, to wit, what they had received. And the issue around the date of Easter is a witness to this, as the two sides, the Quartodecimans and the rest, had inherited two different traditions about how to keep Pascha, Easter, from the apostles. Now, whether there was an ancient tradition in the West of keeping Pascha is a different matter. At the time of the council, they certainly did, and they kept it on the Sunday after the 14th Nisan. The Quartodecimans, inspired by St. John, the evangelist, and St. Philip, who was also involved in it, kept it always on the 14th Nisan. So it didn't matter what day of the week it was. It could be a Monday, it could be a Friday. They kept it that day, and they kept the whole tradition of what was involved. So if you look at Melita of Sardis, there is a long account of the Exodus, what had happened to the Exodus, and how this was fulfilled. It was all pointing towards Christ, as Father John has pointed out. The scriptures that he uses are pointing to Christ's fulfillment on the cross and resurrection. There is no doubt that they should keep Easter. That came from both traditions. The problem was that they had received two different methods of deciding when to keep it, given to them by the apostles. So my point here is that they had both received a tradition, they both believed it was an apostolic tradition, and they both determined to fight their corner. And the Quartodecimans compromised, very probably at the insistence of the emperor. Of course, when all these things happen to compromise, there are always some people who continue as Arians or some people who continue as Quartodecimans. But the bulk of them were prepared to go along with what the rest of the church did. The fathers of Nicaea became an example to subsequent generations who inherited from them a tenacity and a zeal to preserve the faith of the apostles. A tenacity and zeal which is no less significant today. And that's where I'm going to end.